Eleanor sat quietly in her favorite chair by the window, the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock filling the room. Outside, winter painted the world in soft shades of white and gray, but inside, her home radiated warmth, a cocoon of nostalgia carefully curated over decades. The mantel above the fireplace bore the evidence of her life: framed photographs of family gatherings, faded wedding portraits, and a collection of knickknacks from a simpler time. Yet, none of these mementos hinted at the story Eleanor had spent her life suppressing. She glanced at her grandson, Jamie, sprawled on the living room carpet, surrounded by art supplies. His project for school was ambitious, a piece celebrating family history, meant to tie the past and present together through vivid visuals. Jamie's voice, full of youthful curiosity, broke the comfortable silence. "Grandma, what was your life like when you were my age?" he asked, his brown eyes wide and eager. The question was innocent, but to Eleanor, it felt like the first crack in a dam she had reinforced for decades. Her fingers tightened around the knitting needles in her lap, her practiced calm wavering. Jamie's enthusiasm was infectious, and Eleanor didn't want to disappoint him. Yet, how could she answer without dredging up the parts of her life she had buried so deeply? Parts of herself she wasn't ready to face. "Oh, my life was ordinary," she replied, forcing a smile. "There's not much to tell." Jamie frowned, unconvinced. "Come on, Grandma. Everyone has stories. Even Dad says you used to talk about some big dreams you had when you were young. Didn't you ever do anything exciting?" Eleanor's heart sank. Dreams. The word tugged at a memory so vivid it was almost painful. A sunlit summer afternoon, the smell of fresh lavender in the air, and the laughter of a boy she had never allowed herself to forget. She pushed the thought aside, but it lingered like the ghost of a melody she once knew by heart. Jamie's project, titled Family Roots, required artifacts, photos, and anecdotes that would piece together a visual family tree. Eleanor knew her contribution would be inevitable, so she reluctantly agreed to help. That evening, she ascended the narrow attic stairs, each creak of the wood beneath her feet echoing in her chest. The attic smelled of aged wood and forgotten years, a scent Eleanor once found comforting but now seemed suffocating. Dust motes floated lazily in the light of her flashlight, casting shadows on the cobweb-covered boxes stacked against the walls. In the far corner, she spotted a worn trunk with tarnished brass hinges. Her heart quickened as she knelt beside it. This trunk hadn't been opened in over 40 years, not since she locked away the mementos of a chapter in her life she thought she had closed forever. Her hands hesitated on the latch, trembling as if her body understood the significance of what lay inside. With a deep breath, she opened the trunk. Its contents were like whispers from another time: pressed flowers, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and a handful of photographs that looked as though they'd been plucked from someone else's life. But they weren't. They were hers. She sifted through the items carefully until her fingers grazed a particular photograph, its edges curled with age. It showed a young woman, vibrant and full of life, standing beside a man whose face had haunted her dreams. His name was Thomas, but she hadn't spoken it aloud in decades. Eleanor traced the outline of her younger self, her breath catching in her throat. She had been smiling in the photo, but she remembered the moment as bittersweet, full of hope, yet heavy with unspoken fears. "Grandma, did you find anything yet?" Jamie's voice called from downstairs, pulling her back to the present. Eleanor clutched the photograph and closed the trunk, her movements deliberate but shaky. She felt as though she had opened a Pandora's box, and its contents were now spilling into her carefully controlled world. When she returned to the living room, Jamie greeted her with a bright smile, oblivious to the storm brewing within her. She handed him the photo, her fingers reluctant to let it go. "Who's this?" Jamie asked, his eyes lighting up with curiosity as he examined the photograph. "I've never seen this picture before." "It's an old friend," Eleanor replied softly, her voice almost a whisper. A very old friend. That night, Eleanor lay in bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling as if they held answers to the questions she was too afraid to ask herself. The photograph, now safely tucked away in Jamie's project folder, felt like a ticking time bomb. Memories of Thomas, their laughter, their whispered promises, and the decision that had torn them apart played on an endless loop in her mind. She had convinced herself that her sacrifice had been noble, that letting go of Thomas was the right thing to do. But Jamie's innocent questions had forced her to confront the possibility that she had been lying to herself all along. Eleanor had always believed the past belonged in the past, that some stories were better left untold. But as the weight of her unspoken regret pressed down on her chest, she realized that perhaps the time had come to tell the truth, even if it meant reopening old wounds. Jamie's project was no longer just a school assignment. It had become a mirror reflecting the parts of her life she had tried to forget. And as much as it terrified her, Eleanor knew that the journey Jamie had unknowingly set her on was one she needed to take, for herself, for her family, and for the young woman in the photograph who still lived somewhere deep within her. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as Eleanor prepared breakfast. Jamie was already seated at the table, his sketchbook open and pencils strewn across the surface. His youthful energy was contagious, and Eleanor couldn't help but smile at his determination. He had been up early, eagerly outlining ideas for his project. Between bites of cereal, he peppered Eleanor with more questions, his enthusiasm bubbling over like the steam rising from her teacup. "Grandma, what do you think makes a family history interesting? Is it the people, the choices they make, or is it the big moments?" Jamie asked, his brow furrowed in concentration. Eleanor paused, her hand hovering over the teapot. His question, though innocent, carried more weight than he could have realized. She thought back to her own choices, the moments that defined her life, not the grand, celebratory ones, but the quiet, private decisions that no one else had witnessed. She forced a smile, pouring the tea as if that could mask her hesitation. "Well, Jamie," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I think it's all of those things. Sometimes the smallest decisions can have the biggest impact. You might not even realize it at the time." Jamie looked up from his sketchbook, his eyes curious. "What do you mean? Like what kind of decisions?" Eleanor busied herself with arranging the toast on a plate, trying to buy herself time. How could she explain the complexity of her regrets to a 12-year-old boy? How could she tell him that sometimes people make choices they think are right, only to spend a lifetime wondering if they were wrong? Instead, she redirected the conversation. "You'll see as you work on your project," she said, handing him the plate. "Family stories have a way of revealing themselves." Jamie nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer, and returned to his sketchbook. But Eleanor knew this was just the beginning. The photograph she had given him the night before now sat prominently on the table, a silent witness to their conversation. Jamie had placed it beside his other materials, and every time Eleanor glanced at it, she felt a pang of longing mixed with dread. As the day unfolded, Jamie dove deeper into his project, asking Eleanor to share old letters, photographs, and anecdotes about her youth. At first, she hesitated, offering only surface-level details about growing up in a small town, her siblings, and her parents' strict expectations. But Jamie's questions became more specific, more probing, and Eleanor found herself struggling to maintain her carefully constructed facade. "Grandma, did you ever want to do something different? Like not follow what everyone else wanted you to do?" Jamie asked later that afternoon as they sifted through a box of letters in the living room. Eleanor froze for a moment, her hand resting on an unopened envelope. The question struck a nerve. She thought back to her youth, to the dreams she had once harbored and the paths she had been too afraid to take. She felt her chest tighten, the weight of unspoken truths pressing against her ribs. "I suppose everyone has those moments," she replied cautiously, avoiding his gaze. But sometimes life has a way of leading you in a direction you didn't plan. Jamie didn't seem to notice her discomfort. He scribbled notes in his sketchbook, his pencil moving furiously as if he were capturing every word. Eleanor watched him, a mixture of pride and apprehension swelling within her. He was so bright, so curious, so full of potential. She wondered what he would think of her if he knew the full story, the choices she had made, and the love she had let slip through her fingers. Later that evening, Jamie approached Eleanor with an idea that made her heart skip a beat. "Grandma, I want to base my project on your life," he announced, his eyes alight with excitement. "Not just our whole family, but you. You've seen so much, and I think your story could inspire people. Can you help me?" Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse. Her life wasn't a story she wanted to share, especially not the parts she had worked so hard to bury. But Jamie's enthusiasm was disarming, and she couldn't bring herself to dampen his creative spirit. She nodded slowly, her throat dry. "All right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm not sure my story is as interesting as you think." Jamie grinned, completely unaware of the inner turmoil brewing within her. "I bet it is," he said confidently. "We just have to dig a little deeper." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Jamie interviewed Eleanor at length, asking her about her childhood, her dreams, and the pivotal moments in her life. She found herself revisiting memories she had long since tucked away, each question peeling back another layer of her carefully guarded past. One afternoon, as Jamie sketched a preliminary outline for his final piece, he asked a question that caught Eleanor off guard. "Grandma, who's the man in the photo you gave me? He looks so happy standing next to you. Were you close?" Eleanor's breath hitched. She had been dreading this moment, knowing it was inevitable. She stared at the photo, her younger self smiling beside Thomas, the sunlight casting a golden glow over their faces. The emotions the image stirred within her were as fresh as the day it had been taken. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to remain composed. "He was a good friend," she said finally, her voice tinged with sadness. "We were close, yes." Jamie tilted his head, sensing there was more to the story but choosing not to press her further. Instead, he returned to his sketch, humming softly to himself. Eleanor watched him, her heart heavy with the weight of the truth she wasn't ready to share. She knew that Jamie's project was becoming something far bigger than he realized. It wasn't just about family history. It was about uncovering the hidden threads that connected generations, the choices that shaped lives, and the regrets that lingered long after the moments had passed. As Jamie's project began to take shape, Eleanor found herself drawn into his world of creativity and discovery. She admired his determination and his ability to see beauty in the fragments of her past. But with each passing day, she felt the walls she had built around her memories begin to crumble. She knew it was only a matter of time before Jamie's curiosity would lead him to the truth, a truth that she wasn't sure she was ready to face. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when Jamie's project took an unexpected turn. Eleanor had just settled into her armchair with a cup of tea when Jamie burst into the room, his face flushed with excitement. He held a weathered photograph in his hand, the edges frayed and the image slightly faded. Eleanor recognized it instantly. The photo she had unearthed from the attic, the one she had given Jamie reluctantly. She had hoped it would fade into the background of his project, just another artifact in a collection of family memorabilia. But Jamie's eyes were alight with discovery, and she knew the photograph had sparked something inside him. "Grandma," Jamie began breathlessly, "this picture is amazing. I mean, just look at it. The way you're smiling, the way the light hits you both, it feels like there's a story here. Who is he? What were you doing that day?" Eleanor's stomach tightened, a knot of emotions forming that she couldn't quite unravel. She took a slow sip of her tea, trying to compose herself. She had always prided herself on her ability to keep her emotions in check, but Jamie's enthusiasm was like a spotlight shining directly on the one part of her past she had worked hardest to forget. "His name was Thomas," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She set her teacup down, her hands trembling slightly. "He was someone very important to me a long time ago." Jamie perched on the edge of the sofa, leaning forward with an intensity that reminded Eleanor of herself at his age, curious, determined, unwilling to let a mystery go unsolved. "What happened to him?" Jamie asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. Eleanor hesitated. How could she explain the complexities of that summer, the weight of societal expectations, and the choices that had shaped her life? She felt the words forming in her throat, but they caught like jagged stones. "It's a long story," she said finally, her gaze fixed on the photograph. "One I'm not sure you'd understand." Jamie frowned but didn't press further. Instead, he turned his attention back to the photograph, studying it as if it held the answers he sought. "It just feels so real," he said after a moment. "Like there's more to it than meets the eye. I think this picture could be the centerpiece of my project." Eleanor's heart sank. She had hoped the photograph would remain a small, unremarkable detail, but Jamie's artistic eye saw it differently. She knew he wouldn't let it go, and a part of her wondered if that was for the best. Perhaps it was time to confront the memories she had buried so deeply. That evening, as Jamie worked on his sketches in the living room, Eleanor found herself drawn to the box of letters and keepsakes she had retrieved from the attic. She hadn't intended to open it again, but something about Jamie's excitement had stirred a longing in her, a desire to remember, even if it hurt. She sat on the floor, the box in front of her, and carefully unfolded a yellowed piece of paper. It was a letter written in Thomas's familiar handwriting. The words blurred as tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't need to read them to know what they said. She had memorized the letter's contents decades ago, each word etched into her heart like a scar. "Eleanor," it began, "I know this is goodbye, but I want you to know I'll never forget you. You've changed my life in ways I can't even begin to describe. I hope you find happiness, even if it's not with me." The letter was a relic of a decision that had haunted her ever since, a choice she had made out of duty, fear, and a misguided sense of what was right. She had chosen her family's expectations over her own heart, believing it was the noble thing to do. But as the years passed, she often wondered if nobility was worth the cost of her happiness. The next day, Jamie found her in the kitchen, the photograph and his sketchbook in hand. "Grandma," he said, his tone more serious than usual, "I've been thinking. This picture isn't just about you and Thomas, is it? It's about something bigger. I can feel it." Eleanor looked up from her cup of coffee, her eyes meeting Jamie's. She saw a determination in him that both frightened and inspired her. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. Jamie hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I think it's about choices," he said finally. "The ones we make and the ones we don't. I feel like this picture tells a story about a moment that changed everything. Am I right?" Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Jamie's insight was uncanny, and it left her feeling both exposed and understood. She nodded slowly, her voice barely audible. "You're right," she said. "It was a moment that changed everything." Jamie's face lit up, not with triumph, but with a sense of connection. "Then I have to include it in my project," he said firmly. "People need to see this, Grandma. They need to know that our choices matter, even the ones we think are small." Eleanor felt a pang of fear at the thought of her most vulnerable moment being laid bare for others to see, but she also felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Jamie was right. Maybe sharing her story could help others understand the weight of their own decisions. As Jamie worked tirelessly on his sketches, Eleanor watched him with a mixture of pride and apprehension. His vision was clear, his determination unwavering. He had turned a single photograph into the heart of his project, weaving a narrative that was both personal and universal. But Eleanor knew that the photograph was only the beginning. The story it told was incomplete, and she wasn't sure she was ready to fill in the blanks. That night, as she lay in bed, Eleanor thought about Thomas and the life she might have had if she had chosen differently. She thought about Jamie and his unrelenting curiosity, his ability to see meaning where others saw only fragments. And she thought about herself, the woman she had been, the woman she had become, and the woman she still wanted to be. Eleanor knew that the next step in Jamie's project would require her to confront the past in ways she had never imagined. But for the first time in decades, she felt a glimmer of courage. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to let the truth come to light. As the days passed, Jamie's project took on a life of its own. His sketches became more intricate, his questions more pointed, and Eleanor found herself being drawn into the world of her past despite her reluctance. The photograph of her and Thomas had become the centerpiece of his project, pinned carefully to his easel as he worked late into the night. Every time Eleanor walked past the living room, she couldn't help but glance at it. The image seemed to hold a quiet power, as if it were urging her to finally tell the story it represented. One evening, Jamie sat at the dining table, his sketchbook open in front of him, a pencil tucked behind his ear. "Grandma," he said, his tone unusually serious, "I think I need to understand more about you and Thomas. I want my project to feel real. You know, I don't want it to just be a bunch of random family stuff. I want it to mean something." Eleanor hesitated. The weight of her memories felt like a stone in her chest, heavy and unmovable. She had always believed that some stories were better left untold, that the past was the past for a reason. But Jamie's sincerity was disarming, and she realized that he wasn't just asking for the sake of his project. He genuinely wanted to understand her. She sat down across from him, her hands folded neatly on the table. "Jamie," she began softly, her voice tinged with both sadness and resolve, "there are parts of my life that I've never shared with anyone. Not your mother, not your grandfather, not even myself if I'm being honest. But maybe it's time." Jamie's eyes lit up, and he leaned forward, his pencil poised over his notebook. "I'm listening," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor took a deep breath, the words coming slowly at first, like water trickling from a faucet. "I met Thomas when I was about your age," she said, her eyes distant as she looked back through the years. "He had just moved to our town, and he was different. He wasn't like the other boys. He was kind, thoughtful, and he had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the world who mattered." Jamie scribbled furiously in his notebook, but Eleanor barely noticed. She was lost in the memory, the image of Thomas as vivid as if he were standing right in front of her. "We spent every moment we could together that summer," she continued, her voice growing steadier. "We'd ride our bikes down to the lake, talk for hours under the old oak tree, and dream about the future. He wanted to be a writer, you know. He had this incredible way with words." Eleanor paused, her throat tightening as she remembered the letters he used to write her, letters she had kept hidden for decades. "But my parents didn't approve," she said finally, her voice trembling. "They thought Thomas wasn't good enough. He came from a different background, and they had other plans for me. They wanted me to marry someone who could provide a stable life, someone who fit their idea of what a husband should be." Jamie's pencil stilled, and he looked up at her, his eyes filled with empathy. "What did you do?" he asked softly. Eleanor's gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers twisting together as if trying to untangle the knot of emotions in her chest. "I tried to fight it," she admitted. "I told myself that love was enough, that we could make it work. But in the end, I was too afraid. I didn't want to disappoint my family, and I convinced myself that they knew what was best for me. So I let him go." The room fell silent, the only sound the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. Jamie's expression was a mixture of shock and sadness. "You just let him go?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Eleanor nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said, her voice barely audible. "I thought I was being selfless. But looking back, I realized I was just scared. Scared of going against my parents, scared of taking a risk, scared of what people would think." Jamie leaned back in his chair, his notebook forgotten. "Do you regret it?" he asked after a long pause. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with a lifetime of emotions. "Every day," she admitted. "Not a single day goes by that I don't wonder what my life would have been like if I had chosen differently. If I had been brave enough to follow my heart." Jamie was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the photograph of Eleanor and Thomas. "I think people need to hear this," he said finally, his voice resolute. "It's not just about you, Grandma. It's about everyone who's ever been too scared to take a chance. Your story could help them." Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat. She had spent so many years trying to bury her regret, to convince herself that it didn't matter. But Jamie's words hit her like a bolt of lightning. Maybe her story wasn't just a cautionary tale. Maybe it was a lesson, a reminder that life was too short to live in fear. As Jamie returned to his sketches, Eleanor sat quietly, her mind racing. For the first time in decades, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps sharing her story wasn't an admission of failure. It was an act of courage. And as she watched Jamie bring her memories to life through his art, she realized that her past wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to her family, to the next generation, and to anyone who needed to be reminded that love and bravery were worth the risk. Jamie's art project began to take on a life of its own, and Eleanor could feel the energy in the air shift as he poured himself into his work. He transformed the living room into a makeshift studio, covering the walls with sketches and notes, each one a fragment of the story she had shared. The photograph of Eleanor and Thomas remained pinned to his easel, its faded edges a stark contrast to the vibrant colors Jamie used to recreate the moment in his sketches. He had taken her memories and given them form, turning emotions into images that seemed to leap off the page. One afternoon, Eleanor stood silently at the doorway, watching Jamie work. His brow furrowed in concentration as his pencil danced across the paper. The soft scrape of graphite against the page filled the room, punctuated by the occasional sound of him flipping through his notebook for reference. On the canvas before him was a painting unlike anything Eleanor had ever seen. It wasn't just a replication of the photograph. It was an interpretation, a blend of her memories and Jamie's imagination. The young woman in the painting bore Eleanor's unmistakable features, her bright eyes, her hopeful smile. But there was something else in the image that caught her off guard. Jamie had captured not just the happiness of that moment, but also the longing, the weight of the unspoken words between her and Thomas. The way he painted Thomas's eyes, filled with both love and sorrow, sent a shiver down her spine. It was as if Jamie had reached into her soul and pulled out emotions she had buried for decades. "Jamie," Eleanor said softly, her voice breaking the quiet, "this is incredible." Jamie turned to her, his face lighting up with a mix of pride and nervousness. "You think so?" he asked, stepping back to let her see the painting more clearly. "I wasn't sure if I got it right. I wanted it to feel real, like what you told me about that summer." Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes scanning the details of the painting. The background was a sun-dappled field, the grass swaying gently in an invisible breeze. In the center stood the younger versions of herself and Thomas, their hands almost touching but not quite, as if they were caught in a moment of hesitation. It was beautiful and haunting, a perfect encapsulation of a love that had been lost to time. "It's more than right," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. It's everything." Jamie beamed, but there was a seriousness in his expression that Eleanor hadn't seen before. "Grandma," he said, setting down his brush, "I need to ask you something." Eleanor braced herself, knowing that Jamie's questions always had a way of cutting straight to the heart of things. "What is it, dear?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. "Do you think Thomas would have wanted you to let him go?" Jamie asked, his eyes searching hers for an answer. "Do you think he felt the same way you did?" The question hit Eleanor like a thunderclap. She had spent so many years wondering what might have been, but she had never allowed herself to consider what Thomas might have felt. She closed her eyes, the memories rushing back with startling clarity. The way he had looked at her that last day, the way his voice had trembled when he said goodbye. She had convinced herself that letting him go was what he wanted, but now for the first time she wasn't so sure. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told myself it was for the best for both of us. But deep down, I think he wanted me to stay. I think he hoped I'd be brave enough to fight for us." Jamie nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "That's what I thought too," he said. "And that's why I'm making this the centerpiece of my project. It's not just about what happened, it's about what it means. Choices, courage, regret. People need to see this, Grandma. They need to feel it." Eleanor felt a lump rise in her throat. Jamie's words were like a mirror, reflecting back the truths she had tried so hard to avoid. She realized that his project wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever faced a crossroads in their life, everyone who had ever wondered what might have been. As the days turned into weeks, Jamie's painting grew more complex. He added layers of color, each one bringing more depth and emotion to the scene. He incorporated elements from their conversations, subtle details that only Eleanor would recognize. The ribbon in her hair, the wildflowers at their feet, the faint outline of the lake in the distance. Each stroke of the brush felt like a tribute to the love she had lost and the memories she had cherished. But the painting wasn't just for her. Jamie began to talk about how he wanted to present it at the school art exhibit, how he hoped it would make people think about their own lives and the choices they had made. Eleanor felt a mix of pride and apprehension. The idea of her most private memories being put on display for others to see was both terrifying and exhilarating. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Jamie showed her the nearly finished piece. "I think it's almost done," he said, his voice tinged with both excitement and uncertainty. "But I want to make sure it feels complete. What do you think?" Eleanor studied the painting, her eyes lingering on the details. It was perfect, yet it felt incomplete in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Then it hit her. "Jamie," she said, her voice firm but gentle, "there's one thing missing." Jamie looked at her expectantly, his pencil poised over his notebook. "What is it?" he asked. Eleanor hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. "It's not the painting," she said finally. "It's the story. If you're going to show this to the world, people need to know the truth. They need to understand what this moment meant, why it mattered." Jamie's eyes widened, and he nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "But that means you'll have to tell them, Grandma. You'll have to tell them everything." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. The thought of sharing her story, of laying her heart bare for others to see, was daunting. But as she looked at Jamie, at the passion and determination in his eyes, she knew she couldn't hold back any longer. It was time to let the truth come to light, no matter how much it hurt. The school art exhibit loomed closer, and Jamie's excitement was palpable. He had poured every ounce of his creativity and energy into the painting, and now it stood as a monumental testament to both his talent and Eleanor's story. But as the day of the exhibit approached, Eleanor found herself gripped by a growing sense of dread. She had agreed to share the truth with Jamie, to let him weave her past into his project, but she hadn't fully considered the consequences. What would her family think? How would they react to a story she had kept hidden for so long? One evening, Eleanor decided to test the waters. The family had gathered for dinner, a rare occasion when Jamie's parents, Eleanor's daughter Rebecca and son-in-law Mark, managed to break away from their hectic schedules. Jamie was unusually quiet, his excitement muted as he focused on his plate. Eleanor suspected he was nervous about how his parents would react to the centerpiece of his project. She couldn't blame him, so was she. As the conversation shifted from work to school, Jamie cleared his throat. "Mom, Dad, can I show you something?" he asked hesitantly. Rebecca looked up from her glass of wine, her brow furrowing slightly. "Of course, sweetheart," she said. "What is it?" Jamie disappeared into the living room and returned moments later, carefully carrying the painting. Eleanor held her breath as he placed it on the table, the vibrant colors and intricate details immediately commanding attention. Rebecca and Mark leaned forward, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something more complex as they took in the image. "What is this?" Rebecca asked, her voice tinged with confusion. Her eyes darted to Eleanor, a question lingering unspoken in the air. "It's my art project," Jamie said, his voice steady but tinged with nerves. "It's about Grandma, about her life. This is her story." Mark leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he studied the painting. "It's beautiful," he said finally, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure what to make of it. "But what's the story behind it?" Jamie hesitated, glancing at Eleanor for reassurance. She gave him a small nod, and he took a deep breath before launching into an explanation. He spoke with passion, describing how the painting represented a pivotal moment in Eleanor's life, a love she had lost, and the choices she had made. As he spoke, Rebecca's expression hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Wait," Rebecca interrupted, her tone sharp. "You're telling me this is about some man Grandma used to know? A man she never mentioned to any of us?" Eleanor felt the weight of Rebecca's gaze, her daughter's disapproval, hitting her like a wave. "Rebecca, it's not as simple as that," she began, her voice calm but firm. "This is a part of my life I've never shared because it was too painful. But Jamie's project made me realize that maybe it's time." Rebecca shook her head, her frustration evident. "Mom, I don't understand. Why didn't you ever tell us? Why hide something like this?" Eleanor sighed, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. "Because I was ashamed," she admitted. "Ashamed of the choices I made, of the fear that kept me from following my heart. I thought it was better to keep it to myself, to protect you and everyone else from a part of my life that didn't seem to matter anymore." "But it does matter," Jamie interjected, his voice rising slightly. "It matters because it's part of who she is. And it's part of our family's story, too." Mark, who had remained quiet until now, leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Rebecca, maybe we should hear her out," he said gently. "It's obvious this is important to her, and to Jamie." Rebecca looked at Mark, her expression softening slightly, but her eyes were still clouded with confusion and hurt. "I just don't understand why now," she said finally. "Why dig all of this up after so many years?" Eleanor reached across the table, placing her hand over Rebecca's. "Because I don't want to carry this alone anymore," she said softly. "I've spent my whole life wondering if I made the right choice, and I realize now that keeping it a secret only made it harder. Jamie helped me see that it's okay to share my story, even the parts I'm not proud of." Rebecca's shoulders sagged slightly, her defenses crumbling under the weight of Eleanor's vulnerability. I don't know what to do with this," she admitted. "It's a lot to take in." Eleanor nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know," she said, "and I don't expect you to understand everything right away. But I hope you'll try. Because this isn't just about me. It's about all of us and the choices we make that ripple through generations." The room fell silent, the air heavy with unspoken emotions. Jamie looked at his mother, his expression a mixture of hope and determination. "Mom, I think Grandma's story is important," he said. "Not just for us, but for everyone who sees it. That's why I want to include it in the exhibit. I want people to see how powerful our choices can be." Rebecca looked at Jamie, her eyes softening as she saw the conviction in his gaze. She sighed, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You're right," she said finally. "It is important. And if you believe in it, then I support you." Jamie grinned, relief washing over him like a wave. Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude, her heart swelling as she realized that, despite the initial resistance, her family was willing to embrace her story. It wasn't easy, and there were still many conversations to be had, but this was a start. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt a sense of peace, knowing that the truth was finally out in the open. As the family gathered around the painting, discussing the upcoming exhibit, Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had carried her secret for so long, and now for the first time she wasn't alone. Her story was no longer just a source of regret. It was a bridge, connecting her past to her present, and her family to the generations that would follow. The morning of the school art exhibit arrived with a crispness in the air that seemed to sharpen every sound and sensation. Eleanor stood at the kitchen counter, gazing out the window as the early sunlight spilled over the garden. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, nervousness, anticipation, and a faint undercurrent of fear. Jamie had already left for school, eager to set up his display, leaving Eleanor to prepare herself for what she knew would be a day unlike any other. She wasn't just attending an art exhibit, she was confronting the ghosts of her past. By late afternoon, Eleanor found herself standing in the school auditorium, the hum of excited chatter filling the space. Parents, teachers, and students moved between displays, admiring the colorful array of projects that lined the walls. But Eleanor barely noticed any of it. Her eyes were fixed on Jamie's exhibit, which stood prominently near the center of the room. As she approached, her breath caught in her throat. The painting was even more striking under the bright lights of the auditorium. Jamie had added final touches that brought the scene to life. The shimmering reflection of the sun on the lake, the subtle movement of the grass in the breeze, and the faint hint of clouds in the distance. But it wasn't just the painting that drew people in. Surrounding it were Jamie's sketches, notes, and a carefully crafted narrative that told the story behind the image. Eleanor's story. She stood at the edge of the crowd that had gathered around the exhibit, listening as Jamie spoke with a confidence that filled her with pride and awe. "This painting is about my grandmother," he explained, his voice clear and steady. "It's about a moment in her life that changed everything. It's about choices, courage, and the impact our decisions have, not just on us, but on the people around us." Eleanor's heart swelled as she watched Jamie captivate the audience, his words weaving a connection between her past and the present. But as she stepped closer, she noticed someone at the edge of the crowd who made her heart stop. He was an older man, his hair silver, and his posture slightly stooped, but there was something achingly familiar about him. He stood silently, his eyes fixed on the painting, his expression unreadable. It couldn't be. Eleanor's mind raced, her thoughts tumbling over each other in a frantic attempt to make sense of what she was seeing. She hadn't seen Thomas in over 50 years. Could it really be him? As if sensing her gaze, the man turned his head, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The sounds of the auditorium faded into the background, and Eleanor felt as though she had been transported back in time. His eyes were the same, kind, thoughtful, and filled with a depth that had always taken her breath away. She felt her knees weaken, and she gripped the edge of a nearby table for support. "Eleanor." His voice was soft, hesitant, but unmistakable. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. He stepped closer, the crowd parting around him as if sensing the significance of the moment. When he reached her, he stopped, his hands trembling slightly as he clasped them in front of him. "I never thought I'd see you again," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of wonder and sadness. Eleanor swallowed hard, forcing herself to find her voice. "Neither did I," she said, her words barely audible. "I didn't even know you were still alive." Thomas finished for her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I am, and it seems you are too." They stood there in silence, the weight of decades pressing down on them. Around them, the crowd buzzed with curiosity, but Eleanor barely noticed. All she could see was Thomas, the man she had loved and lost, standing before her as if no time had passed. "What are you doing here?" she asked finally, her voice trembling. Thomas glanced at the painting, his expression softening. "I saw the flyer for the exhibit," he explained. "My granddaughter goes to this school. When I saw the name Eleanor and the description of the painting, I thought it might be you. I had to see for myself." Eleanor's heart ached at the thought of him standing in the same auditorium, looking at the same painting that had brought her so much joy and pain. "And now that you have," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas smiled, a warmth in his eyes that made her chest tighten. "Now, I know I wasn't imagining it all these years," he said. "You've lived a full life, Eleanor. And it seems you've inspired a remarkable young man." Eleanor glanced at Jamie, who was watching them with wide eyes, his expression a mixture of surprise and curiosity. She felt a rush of love for her grandson, whose curiosity had brought her to this moment. But she also felt a pang of regret for the years that had slipped away, the moments she and Thomas had missed. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I'm sorry for everything. For leaving, for not being brave enough to stay." Thomas shook his head, his smile tinged with sadness. "You don't need to apologize," he said gently. "We made the choices we thought were right at the time, and maybe they were. We can't change the past, Eleanor, but we can appreciate the present." Eleanor felt tears spill down her cheeks, but for the first time, they weren't just tears of regret. They were tears of release, of healing. "Thank you," she whispered, "for understanding." Thomas nodded, his eyes lingering on hers for a moment longer before turning back to the painting. "It's beautiful," he said softly, "just like the memory." As the crowd began to disperse, Jamie approached them, his face alight with curiosity. "Grandma," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "Who is this?" Eleanor glanced at Thomas, a smile breaking through her tears. "This," she said, her voice steady, "is Thomas, the man in the painting. The man I've told you about." Jamie's eyes widened, and he looked between them with awe. "Wow," he said simply, the weight of the moment not lost on him. Eleanor placed a hand on Jamie's shoulder, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "This is because of you," she said. "You brought us here. You helped me find the courage to face my past." Jamie grinned, his face flushing with pride. "I just told your story," he said. "You're the one who lived it." Eleanor looked at Thomas, her heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. For the first time, she felt the weight of her regret lift, replaced by a sense of peace. The past couldn't be changed, but in this moment, surrounded by her family and the man she had once loved, she realized that it didn't need to be. The present was enough. As the evening unfolded, the crowd at the exhibit began to thin, but Eleanor's heart remained full. She stood beside Thomas, Jamie at her other side, feeling as though her world had shifted in a way she never thought possible. The painting, which had once been a source of trepidation, now seemed to glow with a life of its own. It was no longer just a depiction of her past. It had become a bridge connecting her to the present, and offering her a glimpse of the future. As they lingered near the painting, an older woman approached, her sharp gaze flitting between Eleanor, Thomas, and the artwork. Her silver hair was styled neatly, and she carried herself with a confidence that made Eleanor straighten instinctively. The woman stopped in front of the painting, her lips pursing as she studied it closely. "This is remarkable," the woman said finally, her voice cool but tinged with admiration. She turned to Eleanor. "You're the woman in the painting, are you?" Eleanor nodded, her curiosity piqued by the woman's tone. "Yes," she replied. "It's a part of my story." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, and she glanced at Thomas before speaking again. "I thought as much. You see, I recognize him." She pointed to Thomas in the painting, her finger trembling slightly. "And I think you should know that he and I share a connection." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as the room seemed to tilt around her. She looked at Thomas, whose expression had shifted to one of surprise and confusion. "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked cautiously. The woman's gaze softened, and she took a step closer. "My name is Margaret," she said, addressing Thomas directly. "I'm your daughter." The words hit Eleanor like a thunderclap. She turned to Thomas, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. Thomas's face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. "My daughter," he repeated, his voice cracking. Margaret nodded, her expression a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "Yes," she said. "My mother, your first wife, told me about you before she passed. She said you were the love of her life, but that you disappeared before I was born. I've spent years trying to find you." Eleanor felt as though the floor had fallen out from under her. She looked at Thomas, whose hands trembled as he reached for the chair behind him, sinking into it as if his legs could no longer support him. "Ah, I didn't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never knew." Margaret's expression softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "I believe you," she said. "But when I saw the flyer for this exhibit and recognized your name in the description, I had to come. I had to see if it was really you." The room seemed to hold its breath as Eleanor processed what she was hearing. She looked at Jamie, who stood frozen, his eyes darting between the adults in front of him. "This changes everything," Eleanor murmured, her voice trembling. Margaret turned to Eleanor, her gaze steady. "I'm sorry to intrude on what is clearly a meaningful moment for you both," she said, "but I felt it was important for him to know. And for you to know." Eleanor nodded, her mind reeling. She looked at Thomas, who seemed to be wrestling with a torrent of emotions, shock, regret, and a glimmer of hope. "Thomas," she said softly, This is your chance to reconnect, to have something you thought you'd lost forever." Thomas looked up at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But what about us?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Eleanor, after all these years," I thought. Eleanor reached out, placing a hand over his. "Thomas," she said gently, "you found a piece of your past you didn't even know was missing. That's a gift. And as for us, we'll always have the memories." Maybe that's enough. The words felt both true and bittersweet, but Eleanor knew they were what needed to be said. This wasn't just about her and Thomas anymore. It was about a legacy, about the connections that had been hidden and were now coming to light. Jamie stepped forward, his young voice cutting through the weight of the moment. "Grandma," he said, looking up at her with wide eyes, "I think this is part of the story too. It's not just about what you lost, it's about what you found." And what he found. Eleanor felt a swell of pride for her grandson, whose insight had brought her to this moment. She looked at Margaret, who smiled tentatively, and then at Thomas, who seemed to have aged and softened all at once. "Jamie's right," Eleanor said finally. "This is a story about finding what truly matters." As the evening wound down, the four of them stood together in front of the painting, their reflections blending into the image. It was a moment of closure and beginning, a tapestry of the past, present, and future woven together by the unexpected turns of life. When they finally left the auditorium, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in years. The weight of her regret had been replaced by something new, a sense of hope, of connection, of peace. And as she walked beside Jamie, her heart swelled with gratitude for the boy who had dared to ask questions, to uncover the truth, and to bring a family together in ways she could never have imagined.